This interview goes completely off the rails, and the tension between these two is obvious from the very start. Before we dive into it, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you think about this clash. Every time Piers Morgan and Professor Mohammad Marandi sit across from each other, the conversation turns into a complete train wreck, and this exchange might be one of the most heated yet. What starts as Piers trying to push the narrative that Iran has been weakened, isolated, and humiliated quickly spirals into a full-on clash over propaganda, Western hypocrisy, regime change, and the role Donald Trump and Israel have played in escalating tensions across the Middle East. And what clearly frustrates Piers throughout this interview is that Professor Marandi never really loses his composure. No matter how aggressive the questioning becomes, he keeps pushing back directly on the contradictions in Western foreign policy, which visibly rattles Piers multiple times during the exchange.
I have had other guests, including Victor Davis Hanson just now, who say it's been actually a clear victory for the United States militarily. They've caused enormous damage to Iran's military, which I think is unarguable, and that if they wanted to militarily reopen the Strait of Hormuz, they could do it in a heartbeat, but for political reasons, they're not taking that option at the moment. And that actually no one's quite sure who's running Iran. The new supreme leader has not been seen in public. And therefore, the assumption is that actually it's a rudderless ship and is far more damaged than Iran would ever care to admit. So my first question about that would be, where is your supreme leader? No one's seen him. Is he alive?
Oh, he is alive and well. And Piers, I don't think anyone who knows anything about anything takes anything you say seriously. Because if Iran has been defeated, and if they could take the Strait easily, and if Iran has no leaders and things are falling apart, and the insulting language that you use about Iran, if that was all correct, then it's over. Then you don't have to have this conversation with me. Go and do what you like to do. That's not what's happening, isn't it? The United States has been humiliated, and the Zionist regime has been exposed for the genocidal regime that it is. Of course, last time I asked you 3 times, what do you think about an ethno-supremacist regime? And you refused to answer. But the fact is that the United States is doing all of this and destroying the global economy for an ethno-supremacist regime to preserve that. But if they're really worried about the U.S. economy and the world economy, then why don't they just open the Strait and take out the oil and take the country, and we'll all be refugees like the Palestinians where you kicked them out of their homes in 1948?
I mean, President Trump has indicated that's exactly what he may do if there's no deal.
Well, that's because the West is led by monsters, and you are friends with those monsters, ethno-supremacists and
well, I won't, to be honest with you, look, you know what? You do this, like we have a perfectly civilized conversation, and then you can't resist. No, hang on.
You said S-H-I-T.
You can't resist.
S-H-I-T.
And you can't resist doing is putting your fake halo on your head and pretending that you yourself do not help prop up a monstrous regime. You talk about, America has to be held accountable for killing people. What about Iran's regime, which for 47 years has killed so many people, not least its own people, as we saw in January? Should they be held accountable for that? Would you like to see your regime held accountable for the thousands of protesters it killed in January, for the Americans it's killed, for the Israelis it's killed, for the way it's propped up Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, to cause endless terrorism all over the Middle East? Would you like your regime to be held accountable for that monstrous activity?
Piers, first of all, you used that word that I won't repeat, and that's exactly how you like to frame things. You started insulting Iran, and I gave you a much more civilized response.
What is the word you're talking about? Sorry.
You said S-H-I-T.
No, I didn't.
That's not how I heard it.
No, I didn't.
If that's not what you said.
Sorry, just to be clear.
Okay, then I'm
at no stage of this interview
then I'm mistaken.
have I said that.
Okay, then I'm mistaken.
Yeah,
then I'm mistaken. I thought you said. But first of all, I asked you to come to Iran. You could have seen what Iran is like.
I've asked you to come here. You haven't come either. So you know what?
Well, I've lived there. I've lived there, Piers. Yeah. I've lived there. I've been there many times. Yeah. I did my PhD there. So there's a bit of a difference, just so you.
Yeah, but you haven't come, and I haven't come, so we're in the same boat.
I've been there I was there on the I was actually in that protest that you and I discussed about together in 2003 when you were a somewhat different person than you are now.
I wasn't a different person at all. No, I was exactly the same person.
Let me respond. Let me respond. As a person, well, first of all, I asked you to read that book, Going to Tehran by Flint and Hillary Lever, and I'm sure you didn't bother to do so. But as a person who survived...
To be honest with you,
attacks,
Professor, I know that you think you can just bark out your instructions to me as if somehow I'm beholden to the Iranian regime over what books I should be reading, but I don't really feel that burning desire to read books just because Professor Marandi, the chief propagandist for the Iranian regime, tells me to. Call me naive.
Sure, do what you like. Do what you like. But as a person who survived 2 chemical attacks that your regime helped give to Saddam Hussein, I don't think you or your government or the
I led
regime
the campaign against the Iraq war that my government waged in 2003, as you know.
No, that's not when they used chemical weapons, Piers. They used them in the 1980s, and your government gave it to Saddam Hussein. Back then, he was your friend. Back then, he was your ally. You forget that you've waged 3 wars against my country. We're the bad guys, of course, but you carried out a coup in 1953. Then during the revolution, when people were on the streets, your regime supported the Shah, gunning down people. Then after the revolution, they encouraged Saddam Hussein to invade our country. The West gave him chemical weapons. I survived both mustard gas and nerve agents in 2 separate attacks. Many didn't survive, but that wasn't important in the West back then.
Can I ask you one question before we finish? Just one question. I'm not responsible for what my government did when I was a teenager, just to be clear. But just one question for you.
Of course you are.
No, I've got a question.
Every human being.
No, I'm not.
Every human being who's politically aware is responsible.
I'm asking you a question, though. I'm asking you a question.
And I am too.
Okay, I'm asking you a question, which is one that is put by a lot of my viewers. I'm just curious of the answer. I'm not being accusatory, but you always do these interviews with apparently a full internet signal in a country where many people have had their internet turned off since January. How are you doing that, and why is it one rule for you and another for the large majority of the people of Iran?
Well, first of all, as I told you, you already asked me this question before. During the war, the internet was never off. It was off to international, the international internet, Iranian internet, and Iranian websites and Iranian apps were used. But back then, during the war, they were using the internet to find targets in Iran and to murder people and to destroy Iranian infrastructure. So they limited that. Back then, if you recall, and as I explained, I was not using my own internet. Now they've opened up the internet more. They've helped me to be able to use this, but to use a better internet connection. But as we speak, I am using a VPN, like most other people. But I think the best thing for you to do is to counter my arguments. Your country bombed my country. The United States slaughtered children. And that's why we had internet restrictions. Otherwise, before the slaughter of our people, of our leaders, of our scientists, of our academics, of schools, of bombing apartment blocks, before that, you know what?
Your own regime, according to many reports, slaughtered up to 30,000 of its own people, including children, in January. But you will say to me, nothing to see here. They're all heavily armed militants.
You believe that?
I believe that over you. Yeah.
You believe that? You believe it. So you believe it?
I do. Yeah. I think many thousands of people
then that
were
just shows
slaughtered
that
by your regime. Yeah, I do.
Your regime. Because the evidence shows the Iranians gave the names of all the people who were killed, every single one, 3,117. Hundreds were police officers or officers of the law, and 2,000 of them were people who were caught in the crossfire by people who were armed by your government.
Of course.
Who said they were armed by your government?
They were all killed by the protesters.
Channel 14 of Israel.
That's right, yeah.
Channel 14 of Israel.
Yeah.
Pompeo,
Forgive me,
people.
Professor Marandi, we've run out of time.
But this doesn't show your government killed my people.
You know, Professor Marandi, it's always... The reason I get you on, Professor
people.
Marandi, is it's always interesting to hear a voice from Tehran talking, and I appreciate you coming on. I take most of what you say with a massive pinch of salt, but I appreciate you.
I take it with
but that's fine.
kilos of salt
and that's
when it
fine.
comes to you.
But I appreciate you coming on.
What really stands out in this exchange is not just the hostility between Piers Morgan and Professor Marandi, it's the sheer level of frustration that builds on Piers' side whenever he's unable to fully control the direction of the conversation. And this is something that keeps happening every single time these two speak. The moment Marandi starts challenging the underlying assumptions behind Western narratives on Iran, Israel, or American foreign policy, Piers almost immediately shifts from interviewer into open confrontation. And that matters because Piers constantly presents himself as somebody pursuing objective truth and accountability. But the problem is that accountability in his framing almost always flows in one direction. Iran must answer for everything. Iran must justify itself. Iran must defend every action, every policy, every accusation. But when the discussion turns toward the actions of the United States, Donald Trump, or Israel, suddenly the standards become far more flexible, far more selective, and far more emotional. That's why Marandi's calm demeanor throughout the interview frustrates Piers so much, because instead of reacting emotionally, instead of getting flustered, he keeps redirecting the conversation back toward the broader issue of Western involvement in the region. Whether people agree with Marandi or not, that's the central reason these interviews become so tense. He refuses to accept the framing that only Iran should be scrutinized, while Western powers get to operate without the same moral examination. Take the section where Piers repeatedly pushes the idea that Iran is collapsing internally, that the leadership is weak, and that the country is supposedly on the verge of defeat. Marandi's response is essentially, if all of that were true, then why is the West still panicking? Why are global markets reacting? Why is the Strait of Hormuz still such a major issue? Why is there still this level of obsession with containing Iran? And that's a question Piers never really answers directly, because it complicates the simplified narrative being pushed. Then the conversation moves into the issue of propaganda, and this is where the hypocrisy becomes impossible to ignore. Piers calls Marandi a propagandist for the Iranian regime, but at the same time, he has spent years platforming and maintaining relationships with figures like Donald Trump, someone with a documented history of misinformation, dishonesty, and political manipulation. And that contradiction is exactly why more and more people are beginning to lose trust in mainstream political commentators, because viewers can see when outrage is selective.
You cannot claim to be deeply concerned about authoritarianism, misinformation, and state violence while simultaneously giving endless benefit of the doubt to administrations and governments that have participated in wars, invasions, destabilization campaigns, and civilian deaths across multiple countries. People notice that inconsistency, and Marandi repeatedly forces Piers into uncomfortable territory by bringing that inconsistency to the surface. The internet discussion is another perfect example. Piers tries to frame it as one rule for the elites and another for ordinary Iranians. But the problem is that this criticism falls apart once broader context is introduced. During military conflict, governments restricting internet access, whether people agree with it or not, is not unique to Iran. Western governments themselves have openly discussed digital restrictions, surveillance expansions, and information controls during periods of national security concern. Again, the issue is not whether criticism is allowed, it absolutely is. The issue is whether the standards being applied are consistent. And consistency is where this entire interview collapses. Because Piers wants to present himself as morally outraged by state violence and suppression, while openly aligning himself with people and governments accused of doing the exact same things. That's the contradiction Marandi keeps hammering away at throughout the conversation. Whether it's Iraq, sanctions, regime change operations, support for authoritarian allies, or civilian casualties, the West's own record in the region is extensive. Yet discussions on mainstream platforms often treat Western intervention as fundamentally rational or justified, while presenting every adversarial state as uniquely evil. That's why Marandi bringing up the 1953 coup, Saddam Hussein, chemical weapons, and Western involvement matters. These are not random talking points. They're part of a historical argument about how Western powers have interacted with Iran for decades. And Piers clearly becomes uncomfortable whenever the conversation shifts from present-day accusations to historical accountability. But perhaps the biggest issue exposed here is the media environment itself. Modern political media increasingly rewards confrontation over consistency. Piers Morgan understands that these explosive debates generate views, clips, headlines, and engagement. And to be fair, Marandi understands that too. But what viewers are increasingly noticing is that many media personalities position themselves as defenders of truth, while operating within deeply selective frameworks depending on who their allies are politically or personally. That's why credibility matters. Because once audiences begin to believe that somebody only applies moral standards to geopolitical enemies while excusing allies, trust starts eroding very quickly. And that's exactly what's happening to Piers Morgan in the eyes of many viewers right now. Not because people suddenly agree with everything Iran says, but because they can clearly see the double standards in how these conversations are being framed. At the end of the day, this exchange wasn't really about who won the debate. It was about exposing the contradictions in Western political commentary and the growing frustration people have with selective outrage. And whether Piers likes it or not, every time he gets visibly emotional while Marandi remains composed, it reinforces the perception that these discussions are hitting far closer to uncomfortable truths than he wants to admit.